The View's Whoopi Goldberg commented on police reform yesterday, a few days after the footage from the horrific beating of Tyre Nichols was released. Let's watch.
When will the brutality finally lead to some police reform from the ground up? Because clearly, it doesn't matter if it's a white policeman or a black policeman, it is a problem in the police, in the policing itself. You know, seems things don't seem to make sense to people unless it's somebody they can feel or they can recognize. But how many times do we need to see white people also get beaten before anybody will do anything? I'm not suggesting that, so don't write us and tell me what a racist I am.
Yeah, I don't think she was suggesting that, but she should be a little careful there because white people are brutalized by and Asian people and everyone. They're in fact, in raw numbers, more white people. The issue is that there's a disproportionate relative to their overall representation in the population. Black people are a minority in the. It's like how many is?
We're about 10%. It's lower now. It's like 11, 12, I think.
Right, something like that. So 11% of the population is black. So if it was totally equitable, 11% of police brutality would be black people, way more than that. But still, in absolute terms, there are a lot of white people being the vast majority of people in the country brutalized by the police. So it's not. Don't pretend that this is just an issue that affects.
Yeah, this has been such an interesting moment because the 5 main officers. Now there were 6 officers. It's worth noting, and the 6th white officer has been gone from the discourse. People became aware of that officer's existence in part because one of the body cam footage, you can see their arm tasering, and people started to raise questions. And now this guy, is now been identified and taken off, but not fired in the same way that the black officers have been fired. So that's a whole other issue. But the fact that 5 black officers were involved principally in this case has led some people, I've seen some conservative commentators who say this isn't about race at all. You have Whoopi Goldberg kind of also doing kind of a liberal version of that argument. And the conservatives are framing this as a kind of an own. Like, you guys have been saying this is a racial issue. It's not actually a racial issue. From my perspective, it of course matters that black people are disproportionately policed. Of course that matters. It is also true, and I've been arguing this for a long time, that everyone should care about it because the police are out here beating up and attacking everyone. We've talked about the horrific case of Daniel Shaver is his name, who was one of the most gruesome incidents of police violence I've ever seen.
He was in the hotel. He was killed. We talked about that on the show. It's real bad. And
just like Tyre Nichols, he was given a million contradictory directions. He was not a threat. Tyre Nichols, we still don't know why he was pulled over. He did not have a criminal record. He was 145 pounds despite being rather tall because he had Crohn's disease, seemingly like not someone who was threatening at all and who had committed 0 crimes. But the police are saying, stand up, sit down, put your hands here, put your hands there. At the same time, they're beating him up and flinging him around like a rag doll. I mean, so this is an issue of authoritarian overreach that everyone, regardless of your politics and regardless of your race, should be very concerned about. And to the extent that this is an episode that, because the cops are white, help people to understand that this is about police overreach and the devaluing of the lives of the people that the police come in contact with, more so when they're black, to be honest, because there is a disproportionate impact there. But this should be a wake-up call for everyone to care more about police violence, not to try to minimize what happened here.
But I would say that, and this is a point I've made before, that I think the explicit racial framing of police violence that was, I think you have to admit, was a deliberate tactic by activists on police issues, even more so in recent years with the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't know that has been the most helpful framing for this because it has allowed it to become really politicized. Maybe it would have been politicized anyway, but this is I always try to talk about it, especially if I'm talking about it with people, with Republicans or people who might not be not be down with the Black Lives Matter framing, I would say like this is an issue of government accountability to citizens. The police are employees of the citizens. They're paid by the citizens to keep us safe, not to brutalize citizens or to violate their rights or to hassle them or harass them. In the same way, we're outraged by the TSA doing it, and obviously in a less lethal way than this, or any other, or the DMV person or the IRS agent or whatever. The conservatives want to defund them because it's annoying and more than annoying. It can be really wreck your day or your life to interact with agents of the state this way. And here we see interactions with agents of the state having the most dire consequence of all, death or being beaten up. And let's be angry about that, and talking about it that way, I think maybe makes it less political.
I wrote an article. I'm sorry, I've been preaching this for a long time. I wrote an article in New York Magazine back in 2017 called "Racism Might Have Gotten Into This Mess, but Identity Politics Won't Get Us Out," in which I confront Ta-Nehisi Coates' argument that he was making at the time that America is fundamentally racist. I mean, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that basically he both wanted to hold this idea that America is fundamentally racist, but also we have to specifically frame all of these policies in racial terms in order to get due justice for the people who are disproportionately affected. And to me, that always seemed to be very counterintuitive. If your argument is that Americans like policies less if they understand them to benefit one racial group disproportionately, if you understand that conservatives have historically attacked things like welfare programs by saying, oh, well, these undeserving poor black, brown people are getting it, even though more white people are on welfare than any other group for the same demographic reasons that you explained before, then why would you intentionally frame all of these policies that are, in fact, neutral, even if they disproportionately affect black people because they disproportionately affect poor people? Why would you intentionally frame them all as racial policies? You know that if there's racism in America and people are going to reject a policy out of hand because they see it as racially benefiting black people, why are you self-sabotaging by framing these policies in that way? And it's a little more nuanced than that. And I know that, again, I don't want to diminish what it means as a society for there to be these disproportionate impacts on black people, specifically when it comes to policing. At the same time, though, I do think that there are more people who would be invested in it and care more about it if it wasn't framed as so exclusively a black issue.
Well, and then when you have an incident like this, where it is predominantly, at least, black cops involved beating to death a black man, and then some people trying to defend the racial framing will still say, well, this is still evidence of white supremacy because the system, and then they start going down that route, and it takes almost like a galaxy brain take to kind of explain that, and I think you just get really lost in the weeds then, or some people will tune it out because it takes so much additional explanation to explain why saying that isn't totally ridiculous to most people.
So I think most people making that argument are doing it poorly. I will say that it is completely consistent with people who know what they're talking about, know what they're talking about. Unfortunately, all of this academic race stuff has just taken to Twitter, and a bunch of people who shouldn't be talking are talking. But for example, I often cite a statistic about how you're 4 times more likely to get the death penalty if you kill a white person versus a black person. And again, just like this cop situation, it's about the victim, not the perp. So what that says is that there is a bigger penalty for ending a white life than a black life, regardless of who does it. And so I think that a lot of this, the idea that black people also internalize that bias against black people, it's like a known known. James Baldwin, people have been circulating this quote a lot. James Baldwin, half a century ago, wrote, "Black policemen, or in another matter, we used to say, if you just must call a policeman, for we hardly ever did, for God's sake, try to make sure it's a white one. A black policeman could completely demolish you. He knew far more about you than a white policeman could, and you were without defenses before this black brother in uniform whose entire reason for breathing seemed to be his hope to offer proof that though he was black, he was not black like you." So black people aren't just coming up with this stuff last minute. Oh, it's okay that they're black policemen. It's not about race. It can still be about race, but regardless, it's also about something bigger than that, this authoritarian issue.
And you wanted to react, I think, to a clip from Tucker Carlson talking about the police beating incident. Let's watch that.
So the race riots of 2020, of course, were never about George Floyd, obviously. That's why there are no statues of him in American cities. They were about changing the country forever. And the first step, of course, was defunding police departments across the country and forcing them to lower their standards to attract unqualified applicants, hiring officers based on skin color rather than integrity or skill or self-control, all in the name of equity. Now, does that result in better policing? Well, what happened in Memphis a few weeks ago is one indicator.
So people have pointed out that these people were hired before 2020. The idea that this is some kind of post-George Floyd affirmative action that caused these black officers to be hired just isn't rooted in reality. But if we're talking about how some liberals are weirdly skewing a racial narrative to make it make sense, this seems to me to be a kind of a crazy overreach as well.
Well, it might not be applicable in this specific case. I mean, it is true, though, that police services and firefighter services and other had practiced for some period of time affirmative action to racially balance the composition of the workforce with no benefit, right, to the actual...
Wait a minute. Are you confusing the term affirmative action for diversity, wanting diversity on the force? Because affirmative action, there's some implication that the people hired were not qualified for the jobs. These black officers acting just like how so many other white officers did, doesn't seem to me that they're underqualified as compared to the rest of the force. It seems like they're acting exactly like the rest of the white officers on the force. And that's the problem, that they're acting like police officers, not that they are somehow underqualified police officers.
Well, not every police officer engages in police brutality, right? There are better police officers, and we want more good police officers because we're not going to get rid of policing services.
Sure, but how many white officers have you been talking about over the course of the last almost 10 years since the Black Lives Matter movement has been afoot? I don't have the numbers in front of me. I know there have been some instances of non-white officers, but just numbers-wise, I would be very confident saying that they're overwhelmingly white officers involved in these situations.
I don't know if that's well, again, they should be overwhelmingly white because white people are 70% of the population.
So were those people affirmative action hires who shouldn't have been hired? Is that somehow like they got a leg up because their dad was a cop or something like that, and we should be interrogating their merit as well?
People to be police who show restraint and who are empathetic, regardless of race, rather than say, if we hire a bunch more black police officers, then we'll solve our disproportionate racism problem.
So I agree with the idea that representation in the force is going to solve this problem. Obviously,
you mean you agree that? Okay, right. You agree that it's not going to solve the problem.
It's obviously not going to solve the problem. That was always a ridiculous argument, and only foolish people were making that argument. Mm-hmm. However, that's a different thing than saying
that argument was made, though.
Yeah. And it was foolish.
Yeah.
This argument, though, that these people were underqualified because they're black, that's
I don't know
absurd.
if that's what he was saying.
They're affirmative action hires. If they had hired qualified white officers, this wouldn't have happened.
I think he was just saying if they'd hired qualified officers.
And why would you presume that, apart from the fact that they're obviously
they're not qualified because they just beat someone?
Well, I know, but this argument is not being raised when we're talking about the hundreds, the plurality of officers that are breaking the law, being incarcerated because they have abused or killed civilians in the line of duty. It's a ridiculous shoehorning in to try to pretend that this is about, black people did this to themselves because they wanted representation on the police force.
I don't know that that's what he was saying.
I think that that's what he was saying. You don't have to agree with that, but I think that is what he was saying. And that's the kind of thing that you would say if you weren't making a kind of sincere argument about the fact that this is something that could happen to anyone. And if you care about it happening to you and your brethren, as it very much could, regardless of your race, you should care about police reform. It's worth noting that in Memphis, the police budget has only increased since 2017 by 11.2%, and that the police budget is now 40% of the entire city's budget.
It is something that could happen to anyone, and that bears emphasis. They could have the wrong address, bang down your front door in the middle of the night, and shoot you when you confusingly. It's happened to white people too. It's happened to Asian people. It's happened to old people. It's happened to conservative people.
Yes,
it can happen. We don't want to. So we have to fix the policies and the actual kinds of police officers who are engaged in this work. Some of this work doesn't need to be done at all.
100%.
We'll have more Rising right after this.